We're now live on Facebook, and I would just like to pass over to Eric Fusfield, B'nai Brit International's Director of Legislative Affairs and the Deputy Director of the B'nai Brit International Centre for Human Rights and Public Policy. Eric has monitored the malign influence of Iran and Hezbollah for many years, particularly in the context of recent aggression towards the US. He has also been advocating for a stronger stance by the European Union against such actors. Eric, you have the floor.
Everyone to this important and timely discussion about some of the most pressing issues facing the transatlantic partnership. Headquartered here in Washington, where I am, B'nai Brit is the oldest and best known Jewish advocacy and social service organization with deep roots in both Europe and the Americas. We're a strong supporter of the Transatlantic Alliance and encourage shared responses to mutual dilemmas, such as the threat that terrorism and radical extremism pose to international stability. The recent decision by the German government to ban Hezbollah in its entirety, as the US, the UK, and the Netherlands have already done, is a promising development that raises the prospect of a Europe-wide ban in the destruction of Esther and Mordecai's tomb in Hamadan, Iran, less than a week ago, has underscored the need for an international effort to protect Jewish interests in a country where the regime has espoused anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and anti-Israel hatred for more than 4 decades. The US killing of Iran's Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani, a deep recession triggered by the return of US sanctions 2 years ago and added to very recently, and Iran's mishandling of its COVID-19 response have left the country in political and economic disarray as its flailing regime gropes for answers. These crises have thrown into sharp relief some of Iran's most habitual tendencies, such as its support for terror, its propagation of anti-Semitism, and other nefarious activities. Here to discuss these and other issues related to our topic today are 2 Washington experts on Iran and Hezbollah, respectively. Alireza Nader is a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, focusing on Iran and US policy in the Middle East. He also researches the Islamic Republic's systematic repression of religious freedom and has advised the US government on Iran throughout his career. Prior to joining FDD, Alireza was a senior researcher at the RAND Corporation, where he authored numerous reports and studies on Iran, the Middle East, and US strategy. Dr. Matthew Levitt is the Fromer Wexler Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and director of its Reinhard program on counterterrorism and intelligence. From 2005 to 2007, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. In 2008-2009, he served as a State Department counterterrorism advisor to the Special Envoy for Middle East Regional Security, General James Jones. Matt has written extensively on terrorism, countering violent extremism, illicit finance and sanctions, the Middle East, and Arab-Israeli peace negotiations. I'll now pass the virtual microphone across the Atlantic to my Brussels-based colleague, Alina Bricman, B'nai Brit's Director of European Union Affairs. Alina will introduce our 3rd and final panelist. Alina?
Thank you very much, Eric, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone, also from my side. Thank you for joining us today. As Eric mentioned, I lead the EU Affairs team here in Brussels, so it's very fitting and a great pleasure for me to introduce MEP David Lega. MEP Lega is a member of the European Parliament from Sweden. He's part of the European People's Party, which is the largest political bloc in the EU. He currently serves on the Committee on Foreign Affairs as well as the Subcommittee on Human Rights, which makes him a perfect policymaker with whom to address the topic today. He's also a member of the European Parliament's Working Group on Anti-Semitism, which is a cross-party caucus where B'nai B'rith is an advisory board member, and we have the great pleasure of working together there. So thank you so much for being with us today. And now that all of our speakers have been introduced, it's my pleasure to pass the floor to my colleague Ilan Selby, who is our EU Affairs Officer here in Brussels, to help us jump into the conversation.
Thank you, Alina, and hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in. It's my pleasure to co-moderate this discussion with Mr. Alireza Nader, Dr. Matthew Levitt, and MEP David Lega. Let's get started then, shall we? Alireza, perhaps I can start with you. Iran has been seriously affected by the coronavirus outbreak, with satellite images being widely circulated of newly built mass graves, for instance, and hundreds of thousands of confirmed cases of the virus amongst both society and the political elite. This all came after months of political turmoil prior to the crisis. To begin with, Alireza, could you provide an overview to the current situation in Iran? How has the pandemic been felt at a societal level, and what are the main background elements onto which the pandemic hit?
Thanks for inviting me to speak to you about Iran and the COVID epidemic there. I hope everybody's doing well. I would argue that the Islamic Republic's response to the epidemic has been one of the worst in the world. We hear about communist China getting a lot of blame, but I also think the regime in Iran deserves a lot of blame for failing to address the epidemic in Iran and failing to react quickly enough, or just enough. And I think even now its response has been very negligent. And allowing the coronavirus epidemic to spread from Iran to other countries in the regions. We know that Iran was responsible for the spread of the epidemic to Lebanon, for example, Iraq and Afghanistan as well. When we look at the regime's response, we now know that Iranian authorities knew about the presence of the epidemic in Iran at least from late December. But the regime instructed even doctors to keep quiet about what was happening, fearing that the epidemic would lower turnout in Iran's February parliamentary elections and would damage economic activity as well. And the regime had survived a major uprising in November of 2019. So it felt like it was on very precarious ground. And its first decision or instinct, if you will, was to repress information of the epidemic in Iran. Important religious sites were kept open for months in the city of Qom, which is Iran's holiest city. For example, that city was never quarantined despite early reports of mass deaths in Qom and elsewhere. And I remember even in the beginning stages of the epidemic in February, I believe there were riots in different cities in Iran protesting the regime's lack of response. And from then on until now, the government in Iran hasn't really done very much to contain or curtail the virus. There was never really a shutdown in Iran. The regime didn't really push for a policy of staying at home and social distancing. And throughout this whole time, there's been quite a bit of evidence that life has just returned to normal, even starting a couple of months ago, while the rest of the world was shutting down. Life was continuing in Iran as usual, and the regime was in a lot of ways encouraging this because of what it views as an existential crisis, especially an existential economic crisis. Regime officials, including President Rouhani, felt that they could not risk any sort of serious containment of the epidemic. And now we're hearing that there's been a second cycle of the epidemic with a lot of people getting sick. Of course, we won't know the true numbers possibly ever, because the regime will not release its own numbers or the facts, really, and has really tried very hard to repress information of the epidemic, including making arrests and imprisoning people who speak about the epidemic, especially to broadcast based outside of the country. So until I think a vaccine comes out or there's some medication, I wouldn't be surprised if the coronavirus becomes really, its defeat will be very difficult in Iran, I think, without outside intervention, because the regime has proven that it's not really willing to react. I think there's also this issue of U.S. sanctions preventing a fight against the COVID epidemic in Iran. While I think that sanctions do dampen international enthusiasm for doing business with Iran and could cause some problems, I think when you really look at reports coming from Iran, they show that corruption, the regime's negligence, inattention to the epidemic, unwillingness to close off religious and political sites have really created the conditions for the epidemic to spread in Iran. So what can we look forward to in the next few months in Iran? I think the regime will increasingly become unstable. Already officials such as former President Mohammad Khatami have predicted a new round of violence, much like the November uprising. There haven't been much disturbances in Iran in recent weeks, but that could change very quickly, especially as the Iranian currency depreciates again, which is usually an indicator of unrest, social unrest in Iran as well. And I think it's possible that the regime can last until the U.S. presidential election in November. I believe regime officials are counting on a Biden presidency to be more amenable to either going back to the nuclear agreement or new negotiations. But even I think if there's a Biden presidency, I don't expect Iran to really remain stable unless a major new nuclear agreement is reached or the regime receives major cash infusion from the Biden administration as a prelude to negotiations. But looking forward, I think Iran is going to be very unstable because the regime doesn't really have the will or the resources to administer the country. And I really view the Islamic Republic in a lot of ways as a failing state because it has demonstrated an unwillingness to take care of the population, not just on the COVID epidemic, but on a number of other issues as well, from water shortages to providing service to the public. And I think Dr. Levitt will talk about the wider region and Hezbollah as well. So I'll stop here, and if you have any questions, I welcome them.
Thank you, Alireza. And perhaps if we can delve deeper into Iran at this moment, it certainly, as you've said, the health situation in Iran is particularly worrying, and we hope that those suffering are able to fully recover. As you alluded to in your remarks, there is a political element to the crisis. In the past week, we have heard reports of a civil war of sorts breaking out between the Rouhani-led Iranian government and the Khamenei-led or Khamenei-governed Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. Just how significant is this internal dispute? And perhaps if you could explain what are the main motivations behind this disagreement, both in terms of management of the COVID-19 crisis and in terms of foreign policy considerations?
I think a lot has been made about differences and divisions between Rouhani and the Revolutionary Guards. I don't think they're significant because Rouhani is very powerless in Iran. He doesn't really have the authority to administer the country. And he regularly, even himself, complains about being very limited in authority. I think his presidency has shown that he just goes along with policies determined by Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Revolutionary Guards. I have not seen any significant pushback from him or his administration on the regime's policies on a number of fronts, whether they be handling of the COVID crisis in Iran or arming the Assad regime and Hezbollah and other proxies in the region. Rouhani has not behaved in any way to differentiate himself from other factions in the Islamic Republic. I'm not sure which, I think it might have been an American paper, probably the New York Times, that regularly peddles this false dichotomy between Rouhani and the Revolutionary Guards. Rouhani essentially just carries out what the regime determines at this point. And I have not seen any signs in which the population in Iran actually differentiates between what Rouhani is doing and what the Revolutionary Guards are doing. That dichotomy is also very much absent in the Persian language world, that, on television and social media. Iranians, I would say the vast majority of Iranians don't think there are differences between these two camps.
So maybe I'll jump in here and bring in MEP Lega to comment a little bit on the situation in Iran. Alireza mentioned an existential crisis. You spoke of corruption and secrecy. And as Eric mentioned in the beginning, of course, the coronavirus crisis only kind of aggravated a lot of pre-existing issues. And the whole last year was an incredibly tumultuous one. We saw the downing of the Ukrainian flight that killed 176 people. There was another incident where 19 sailors died in an incident in the Gulf of Oman. We've seen violent responses to protesters, yet the EU's response has been rather soft. So I would be curious, what is your take on the EU's approach to Iran, also especially in this new pandemic reality, as well as in terms of sanctions, the nuclear program, etc. So what do you think, if anything, the EU could be doing differently? How could the EU be taking a stronger stance?
Well, thank you. Am I on? Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me as well to this very important discussion. I have been an MEP for 1 year, so I haven't followed the whole history of the discussions regarding Hezbollah or classing all of Hezbollah as a terrorist, not only one branch, but all of it as a terrorist organization. But if we start with the Ukrainian passenger jet, I think that as for the downing of that, the European Union would need to continue pushing for an independent international investigation and also demand full transparency and accountability from Tehran. And we haven't had a time to discuss the naval incident much yet, but I truly believe that is a matter of concern for Tehran as well. And what both these incidents indicate, however, is that there is certainly room for improvement within the chain of command structures of Iran's armed forces. And if we go to the steps that are necessary to overcome in order for Hezbollah to be designated a terrorist organization, because that is extremely important if we look at it from a European Union perspective. So I believe that it all comes down to convincing the European Union of Hezbollah's destabilizing role in the Middle East and beyond, both in its own right and as a proxy of Iran. So in my perspective, these issues are very closely connected.
Thank you, David.
Before jumping back to Ilan, I just wanted to say that I think it's really important for MEPs who have not been historically engaged with the topic to be willing to take it on, to educate themselves on the topic and to become real allies. And I think it's still a very timid movement within the European Parliament, and I hope more people tend to take your lead and become more active on this. So I think it's only to be commended that regardless of not having worked on this for a long time, you're taking this on. I'll pass it back to Ilan now.
Thank you. Alireza, perhaps I can come back to you for this question. And as has been mentioned previously, the route that the US has sought regarding a sanctions policy towards Iran has been very different to the EU, and we've seen in the past few hours reimposed sanctions or reissued sanctions from the US administration. Perhaps as a lead on to our discussion with Matthew on Hezbollah, if I could ask you, Alireza, what effect have the previously reimposed sanctions by the US administration had on Iran, as well as on its wider spheres of influence, particularly in Lebanon?
No doubt the sanctions are having a massive effect on Iran's economy. I don't think, I can't think of any other sanctions regime in the modern era, such as the one that's been placed on Iran, virtually shutting off its economy, kind of like an economic blockade in a way. Interestingly, the regime in Iran has not changed its policies in the region significantly. I think, and some critics of the maximum pressure policy against Iran, critics of the US policy, maintain, well, the regime in Iran hasn't changed its policy, so the policy itself is a failure. But I would argue that in addition to really killing the regime's resources, the maximum pressure campaign and sanctions in general are making the regime in Iran very unstable, because it's already a very much hated regime for a number of reasons. And what keeps it going is the regime's ability to pay the security forces and the Basij and the Revolutionary Guards. And those forces are under severe pressure. When we look at the regime's allies and proxies across the region, we see the same story. Hezbollah is facing immense pressure in Lebanon, which has a very troubled economy, to put it lightly. And we see the Assad regime face financial difficulties and fissures within the elite as well. So in terms of preventing the Islamic Republic from funding a lot of these policies, I think maximum pressure has been successful. Now, I think if there's a new U.S. administration that wants to reverse these unprecedented pressures, then the situation could change dramatically. I know just from being in touch with a lot of Iranian dissidents and opposition activities, that's what they fear the most, that a future democratic administration, even maybe a second Trump administration, may want to negotiate with the Islamic Republic because the Iranian leadership is going to feel more and more desperate as time goes by. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in November. I think it could have really a dramatic impact on what's happening inside Iran, because if the current sanctions regime continues, something has to give. The dam has to break, whether it's inside Iran or in the broader Middle East. I don't think the status quo can continue as it has for the last few years.
Thank you, Alireza, and I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say we'll be keeping a close eye on the US presidential race and elections come November time. Matthew, thank you for being so patient. And as we move the discussion on to the situation in Lebanon, and the effects that the coronavirus crisis has had on Hezbollah, both within the region and more broadly. Perhaps we can first discuss the political situation there. In October 2019, widespread protests broke out in Lebanon, focused on economic issues, political corruption, sectarian rule, and so on. Since the coronavirus outbreak, we've seen these protests becoming scarcer, but nonetheless they continue. So Matthew, perhaps you can speak to the background of these protests, whether they've had any effect, and on the extent to which they've taken on a confessional or sectarian element.
First of all, thanks for including me in this panel. It's a real pleasure, and kudos to B'nai B'rith for holding it. Look, prior to the outbreak of COVID-19, you had already in Lebanon a series of events that were happening around the same time, a severe economic crisis that now, of course, with COVID-19 is exacerbated significantly. A increase in sectarian tensions, largely as a result of two things. One, Hezbollah's deep involvement early on in the war in Syria in defense of the Assad regime, together with Iran and other Iranian proxies, primarily from Iraq, but also fighters from Afghanistan and Pakistan and elsewhere. This was despite the fact that the government in Lebanon at the time, backed by Hezbollah, had a policy of disassociation from the war in Syria, and everyone disassociated except for Hezbollah, which went in full force. The other factor that led to the rise in sectarianism, and which in a sense kind of helped Hezbollah kind of deal with some of the whiplash, the backlash that came as a result of its fighting in Syria and the slip and slide of some of this violence from Syria into Lebanon. What kind of saved it a bit was the rise of the Islamic State, of Daesh. And Hezbollah was able to present itself as being the element most capable of defending all Lebanese from these far more radical Salafi jihadis. How the extent to which that is true or not true is irrelevant to the ability that Hezbollah had with some success of portraying itself in this light. But then came a bunch of things that really demonstrated in very tangible ways for Lebanese who really don't want another war with Israel. Hezbollah does at some point, not right away, didn't want to fight two wars on two fronts in Syria and in Israel, but most Lebanese don't. And a series of things happened to really underscore the extent to which Hezbollah was prioritizing its own, not just sectarian, but its own party interests and those of Iran ahead of its fellow Lebanese. So think, for example, about the fact that Hezbollah was building factories or places to put guided systems onto the missiles that it was getting from Iran, older missiles, to create a precision-guided missile program. So in the past, Hezbollah had many missiles that it could shoot in a general direction at an Israeli civilian community, and now it wanted to basically put an add-on kit that would make it GPS guided and able to hit something with even greater accuracy. And it was putting those together in plants, some of which the Israelis exposed, many of which were in civilian neighborhoods, near the airport in Beirut, beneath a soccer stadium, etc., effectively using Lebanese citizens as human shields, obviously without their consent. Consider, for example, Hezbollah's continuing to assassinate any Lebanese politician it doesn't like. So the UN Special Tribunal for Lebanon, just a few months ago, added new charges against some of the Hezbollah operatives that it had already charged for the assassination of former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri to the docket. It turns out there were more Lebanese politicians that Hezbollah assassinated. This is not something to do with Israel. This is just Hezbollah finding ways, if by politics, fine. If by buying favor, fine. If by force, fine too, to establish itself in Lebanon. Remember that back in 2008, Hezbollah literally took over downtown Beirut by force of arms, an act that the government of New Zealand actually considered an act of terrorism when designated part of Hezbollah in New Zealand. And then consider finally the very tangible actions that the US government and others exposed about how Hezbollah was actively undermining the Lebanese financial system, pumping the ill-gotten gains from narcotics trafficking and money laundering and other crimes through the Lebanese financial system. The US Treasury Department designated the Jamal Trust Bank, which was knowingly taking in this money and looking the other way. They designated very senior Hezbollah political figures. And I say political with quotes because they were political figures, but they were doing many other things as well. And in some cases, some of these political figures, people like Hassan Hadroj, are engaged in things like weapons procurement. He's been indicted in the United States. And in other cases, these were parliamentarians very involved in the illicit finance. So some of them were literally going up to Lebanese banks and saying, you know, I'd hate for something to happen to you or to your family if you stopped taking Hezbollah money. And by the way, here's some Hezbollah money, just put it into account under someone else's name so it doesn't say, you know, Hezbollah's money. And therefore actively undermining the credibility and the stability of the Lebanese financial system. So against that whole backdrop, you have COVID. COVID did two things. One, again, like the rise of the Islamic State, this also, the rise of COVID, is a terrible phenomenon, but it actually gives Hezbollah an opportunity to crawl out from under the bad press it was getting for all these other things. And it sent people out into the streets to clean streets and to do things. Hezbollah is able to send people out for these types of things. But that's not the totality. In fact, it's by no means anywhere near the majority of what Hezbollah is doing. It's still very actively fighting in Syria. It is still using Iraq as a cash cow. And the reason it's doing that is because of sanctions on Iran, because of the very sharp drop in the price of oil. Iran suddenly doesn't have the same amount of money to give to Hezbollah. In 2009, similar situation happened, and for a period of time, we now know Hezbollah lost about 40% of its income from Iran. According to the US State Department, Hezbollah has a budget of approximately $1 billion with a B that comes mostly from Iran and also from illicit finance, businesses, and some donations. So Hezbollah is experiencing a very significant financial crunch. And at the same time, it desperately wants to kind of scratch the resistance itch. What I would describe as the terrorism itch, what they describe as the itch to resist Israeli occupation. Of course, Israel withdrew in 2000, but Hezbollah still itches for a fight. And because of its presence in Syria and because of its activities domestically in Lebanon that have undermined its position, Hezbollah desperately wants to be able to do something to show that it's still the one that's, you know, fighting Israel. And so for years, it invested a tremendous amount of money in attack tunnels, not smuggling tunnels, tunnels meant to carry out attacks into Israel, which were discovered by the Israel Defense Forces and shut down. And it now is leveraging other types of what some would describe as its civilian organizations and infrastructure for specifically operational military terrorist purposes. So with a colleague of mine last week, I published a piece on Hezbollah's environmental NGO. They call it Green Without Borders. And it does environmental issues. It also specifically plants trees to block security cameras. And the UN had to go and trim some of those back because they're planted on the Israeli side of the blue line. You've had Hezbollah trying to do things to the security fence to poke Israel so they can have press saying we're still doing things. They launched a drone into Israel in late March. And in particular, most specifically, we saw September of last year, Hezbollah fired 2 Kornet anti-tank missiles from Lebanon into Israel near the communities of Avivim and Yeron. On the Lebanese side, it was Aitarun and Marun al-Ras. And they hit an Israeli military ambulance. Thankfully, no one was killed. But they launched these rockets from Green Without Borders environmental posts. There's obviously nothing environmental about that. And so I'll just conclude my opening comments by saying this is, I think, a very powerful and tangible example for my European colleagues in particular. And I have spent a long time on this and have collected many miles to and in Europe on this issue. testified on this issue before the European Parliament. And one of the issues for many Europeans is a discomfort with designating an entity that is a political party and that has non-terrorist and non-military wings. And one of the things I've tried to draw home for my European colleagues is that this is part of the brilliant intentional structure of Hezbollah, and you need to take a close look at the ways that the politicians engage in illicit terrorist and military conduct. You need to look at the way they leverage their civilian infrastructure for expressly non-civilian, in this case, non-environmental purposes. You need to look at the way that they raise funds for things that would be otherwise legitimate under the EU partial designation from July 2013. Unless the Europeans can demonstrate that a euro that's being raised is specifically for the terrorist or military wing, then it's legitimate. Not in the UK, not in Germany, not in the Netherlands. And that designation has had some positive benefits. Certainly it helped with Operation Cedar several years ago, where 7 European counterparts with the US Drug Enforcement Administration cracked down on a Hezbollah drug-running money laundering ring, leading to not only arrests but convictions in a Paris court of people like Mohammed Nuruddin, a very senior Hezbollah operative, along with some other people who actually were not Hezbollah but were Lebanese criminals, and that's to be commended. But Hezbollah has reacted to the partial designation by realizing that as long as they stay within a certain lane, they can operate with impunity in Europe, and they have. And so I think Europe needs to rise to that challenge and make it clear that Europe is not to be considered a comfortable place for Hezbollah to operate. And I take that term comfortable place, that's not my term. That is a term that the German Ministry of Interior reported on in a report to the German Parliament from their perspective on how Hezbollah sees its ability to operate, not just in Germany, but in Europe more broadly.
Thank you, Matthew. And as you mentioned, it is very worrying to see this, among other things, the social guise that Hezbollah engages in regionally as a means to boost its domestic standing in order to further its overarching political ambitions. Now, on the topic of the designation issue that you've mentioned, the separation of powers between the Hezbollah political and military wings, or the so-called Hezbollah political and military wings, is a separation denied and even ridiculed by Hezbollah itself. And yet in Europe and across the world, as you've mentioned, many states and organizations continue to solely view Hezbollah's military wing as a terrorist group. So I would ask, where does this split designation actually originate? And what do you believe are the motivations behind states and organizations making such a distinction?
So look, let's be clear. Like many large organizations, Hezbollah does a lot of different things. And so it does engage in politics, and it does engage in civilian activity, and has healthcare programs and educational programs. It has the Mahdi Scouts. It's kind of like what we have in the United States, a Boy Scout program. The difference is Boy Scouts here develop skills to be able to be good leaders, and the Mahdi Scouts learn about hating Israel and hating Jews and get military, indoctrination. So it's not like this is made up. There are different wings to the group, but they are all leveraged for a singular purpose. Again, as you said, in Hezbollah's own words. In my many interactions with colleagues within the European Union, I see a variety of themes that have caused hesitancy. One is concern about retribution. If you think about the series of Hezbollah bombings in Paris in 1985 and 1986, if you think around the same time about plots in Germany and Switzerland, in Italy, many Europeans are worried that if they were to do something that Hezbollah didn't like, Hezbollah would respond with terrorist activity. I just don't think that this rises to the occasion. There are significant risks to Hezbollah in carrying out attacks against European powers. There are things that Hezbollah doesn't want to bring upon itself, and while a designation would be very significant, it doesn't rise to the threshold for Hezbollah wanting to blow up the world. This is not the equivalent of a European country sending in its armed forces to help, implement UN Security Council Resolution 1701 or something like that. The second is, to be perfectly blunt, a very common misreading, or really, to be honest, misunderstanding of the European Union's own CP 931, Common Position 931, which is the legal backbone for a designation or what you in Europe would call prescription of an entity under terrorist grounds. In fact, I had now for years when I go to Brussels to talk about this issue, I carry a copy of CP931 in my jacket pocket, so that when I'm told things like, Dr. Levitt, you need to understand, in Europe, we can't designate an entity until there's been a legal case against it and it's been convicted in court. It's just not true. There's a lot of things that people don't understand. And one of the most critical is the idea, the concern that if Hezbollah was designated writ large under CP931 by the European Union, that the European Union itself and European Union member states would be barred from having interaction with with Hezbollah politicians who are part of the Lebanese government. And that's just not the case. If Hezbollah was designated in full by the European Union tomorrow, European Union officials, I would advise against it, but they could go meet with Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah in front of the cameras tomorrow, and there's no legal ramification. You can go to the EU's website and see CP931 in a whole bunch of languages for yourself to see that this is the case. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about what a designation does and doesn't do.
Thank you, Matthew, for that really illuminating and very pertinent presentation of how, I think especially the way that Hezbollah manages to portray itself as a significant social and civilian actor. And I think that definitely hits the nail on the head with regards to the issues that we're facing on a European Union level, because it seems as though the European Union indeed is really clinging to this political wing of Hezbollah in order to maintain a partnership with Lebanon. So I want to go to you, David, to see your perspective basically to Matthew's commentary about the struggles that the EU has had with the designation. Why do you think, from your perspective, there is such a reluctance? Do you see anything else on top of what Matthew mentioned? And what do you think we might expect in the future with this timid move towards actually designating Hezbollah in full?
Thank you so much. I would like to start by saying that I totally agree with the former speaker as well, because these are very relevant issues, and this is very important reasons to why the EU has been so slow. In my perspective, there is no differentiation, and we cannot make any between the two wings. Rather, the political wing or the military, because in the political wing is where the decisions are ultimately taken. And why we haven't done it so far, I believe that this is a failure by the former EU foreign ministers. They should have been able to do this many years ago, not least after the 2012 attack in Burgas. Already then we could actually have had this decision. If I can add a few reasons why this has been such a slow process within the European Union, I believe one of them is, unfortunately, due to the fact that anti-Semitism is on the rise again across Europe as well. If you look at my home country, Sweden, we have criticism of the policies of the Israeli leadership, which is unfortunately used as a pretext to sing anti-Semitic chants in the streets, spread conspiracy theories claiming that the Jews impede peace in the Middle East, or, as we see now, even are behind the corona pandemic, and etc. But the growing anti-Semitism is fueled by Islamists and as well as by a range of extremists to the right and to the left on the political spectrum. But far more worrying is when this is and the national governments and the EU leadership, through their policies and actions, indirectly legitimize or even fuel such sentiments, often out, unfortunately, of economic concerns. I mean, look, if I go back to Sweden again, I fear that one reason for my own government's reluctance to label Hezbollah in its entirety a terrorist group is due to its economic ties with Iran. Let's not forget that when our current foreign minister, Ms. Alina, when she was Minister for Trade, she led a Swedish delegation to Iran, where all female members, including herself, decided to wear veils when they went there. So there is a fear of losing the economic position towards Iran as well, which unfortunately is part of the reason, I believe.
Absolutely, David. And as you've just spoken to, it's clear that the threat posed by Hezbollah is not simply a Middle Eastern threat, it's a European threat, a global threat. Attacks and planned attacks around the world, including in Europe, illustrate the presence that Hezbollah has in various countries. Matthew, therefore, if I could ask, and in an attempt to quell this global presence, and you've spoken to this prior, what tangible effects from labelling Hezbollah a terrorist group are had on its activities in both the specific place of ban and more broadly in terms of wider knock-on effects?
So I want to, before I answer your specific question, I want to add one more thing that I should have mentioned as to a reason Europeans often tell me that they're concerned about designation. Well, two really. One is they're concerned about stability in Lebanon. I had actually had one senior European official tell me, don't get me wrong, because I countered saying I actually see Hezbollah as a deeply destabilizing factor in Lebanon, and explained why. And he responded, well, you're right, I agree, but if Hezbollah is doing this much bad, but they could be doing this much bad, then really that's almost like being a stabilizing factor. It's as if I tell you, I'm only going to punch you in the face, but I'm not going to shoot you with a gun. And there are ways to deal with Hezbollah that would actually stabilize Lebanon. And I think that a designation would be one of them, because it would make it much more difficult for Hezbollah to raise funds, engage in criminal activity within the European Union. It would create a greater pretext for criminal and terrorism investigations, both. It would significantly increase the ability to cooperate at a law enforcement and intelligence level across Europe and within institutions such as Europol. Europol, I should note, by the way, is already taking a leading role quietly on Hezbollah. The United States has put together something called the Law Enforcement Coordination Group, the LECG, which brings together law enforcement officers from around the world. And it took some doing, but Europol has become a full-fledged participant. Europol has hosted several meetings in Lyon. Europol has actively worked to get others involved in this, and it's had tremendous benefits. And I think one of the reasons you're seeing the beginnings of a shift in Europe and elsewhere around the world, you've seen several recent designations in South America, is as countries are becoming aware of the extent of the activities that Hezbollah is engaging in around the world, the modus operandi, they are realizing that this is a problem. David, for example, you're in Sweden. I, off the top of my head, cannot come up with an example of Hezbollah activity in Sweden. But without blinking an eye, I could give you the names of 3 different Swedish citizens who are Hezbollah operatives, not Hezbollah politicians, not Hezbollah child care workers, Hezbollah terrorists who have been arrested around the world, one at the airport in Israel on his arrival to carry out an attack, one who was procuring and collecting explosives material to build Hezbollah bombs in Thailand, and one of whom was one of the individuals arrested and convicted in Cyprus. And so you begin to map these things out, you get a better understanding. There's a particular hesitancy among Francophile countries because of the historical, social, political, and business connections. And I think that also there's beginning to be just the tiniest, I don't want to overplay it, the tiniest bit of change, in part because the US government has engaged in a series of designations revealing the extent to which Hezbollah is running companies in such countries. A whole bunch of companies, for example, in Belgium. Or, for example, the fact that when Hezbollah bought a safe house in Cyprus, where it was storing ammonium nitrate for explosives, that safe house was purchased by a Lebanese-French dual citizen who was a professor in Lyon at the time. And so they're using European operatives for very, very tangible operational benefits. And a designation would go a very, very long way to making Hezbollah much more uncomfortable and European authorities much more capable of cracking down on that type of activity.
Thank you very much, Matt. As we come towards the ending part of our discussion, I want to end on a constructive note as much as possible. So I would ask all our three speakers to reflect from their different perspectives, whether it's an EU perspective, an American perspective. How can we, and by we I mean policymakers and civil society alike, play a part in actually mainstreaming the necessity to recognize the threat that Hezbollah is placing, and to move forward this conversation on banning Hezbollah in its entirety. So perhaps we begin with Alireza, we then move to Matthew, and we end with David, for whom this conversation is perhaps the most relevant. So Alireza.
All right. I just think the Hezbollah designations are really positive sign among European countries, not just regarding Hezbollah, but I also think Europe's relationship with the Islamic Republic, which needs a whole reassessment, given what's happened in Iran in the last 2 years, starting with massive popular demonstrations in December 2017 to the November uprising. I think those events demonstrate that Iranians don't want to be ruled by the Islamic Republic, that they want change, and a lot of the people in the Middle East that are ruled by proxies allied with the Islamic Republic want the same thing. They want independence from the regime and its proxies. My advice to any European policymakers or analysts or advocates is to really listen to what people inside Iran are saying, people across the region to what they're saying, and don't think that there are quote unquote moderate factions or different wing in Iran or different wings of Hezbollah. They're, pretty much operating along the same ideology and pursuing the same interests and objectives. And that's not going to change as long as you have the current regime in Iran. Its policies will not change. The nuclear threat it presents will not change. So I think European countries need to really reassess their relationship with the Islamic Republic. And the last couple of years have already also demonstrated that pressure against this regime can work. And I think European governments, instead of being afraid of what potentially Hezbollah or the regime in Iran could do and the trouble they could cause, as Dr. Levitt said, they need to act to constrain their ability to cause these problems in the first place.
Thank you, Alireza. Dr. Levitt.
So first of all, let me thank you again for holding this session, and thank you for including me. I would say that there are a handful of real opportunities now. First of all, as we've discussed, there really is now a more serious conversation about a full designation of Hezbollah, especially after Germany took its action. And that is something that I think is only going to become more acute of a conversation as more examples of Hezbollah businesses and illicit conduct, and even sometimes operational conduct, as I gave you an example in Cyprus, come to light. The second is there's a need not only to push for a full designation, but for derivative designations. In 2013, the European Union designated Hezbollah's military and terrorist wing. There has been not a single EU follow-on designation from that. Does the EU truly believe that there is nobody within the EU? And by the way, under CP 931, it doesn't have to be someone within the EU. It doesn't even have to be based on any action within the EU. Is there nobody worthy of designation by the EU within its terrorist and military wings? I'm happy to give you a list of many if you'd like. And we should be bolstering those regimes and making them serious. We should be expanding that, frankly, to be looking at other Shia militant entities, as we do on the Sunni side as well, because increasingly, by virtue of having fought together in Syria under Iranian Quds Force command, Lebanese Hezbollah, Iraqi Kataib Hezbollah, the Fatamiyun and Zinabiyun, Afghan and Pakistani militias, they are very intimately connected now. And in fact, As I recently wrote in an article for the Combating Terrorism Center at the U.S. Military Academy, there's a lot of concern that the next Hezbollah attack might not even include a Lebanese citizen. It might include a citizen of these other countries. And finally, most tangibly, Lebanon is in a severe, severe economic crisis. And it should be the international community's desire to help them. But there are conditions, and those conditions have to be anti-corruption and transparency. Hezbollah does not want that. This is a tremendous opportunity to help people in Lebanon who don't want Hezbollah to take over the country, to empower them in order to get the support they need that we should want to give them. There have to be basic standards that come down to things that would make it more difficult for Hezbollah to undermine the Lebanese economy.
Thank you, Matthew. MEP Lega.
Yes, thank you so much. I also would like to start by thanking you for hosting this panel discussion. And I hope that I can stay in contact afterwards with my fellow panelists as well, because I really appreciate all the information they have given today. And I totally agree, not the least with what was just said. I mean, we know that Iran is legitimizing and defending al-Assad's rule and fueling the war in Syria, a war that is causing unprecedented human suffering across the region, widening the Shia-Sunni divide and creating mass migration flows. And with this, I believe that we have reasons enough for the EU as a whole to follow the examples of Germany, Netherlands, and others already. But in order to succeed, because I am more positive than I was a year ago before I started, that this will be the next step, that we will find ways to designate all of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. But in order to reach that, I would love more contact with my fellow panelists today, but also I need more help from you, David, and other civil society organizations as well, because you do play a key role in persuading and pushing the European Union and our member states to everything, through all your letters, emails, phone calls to the heads of government, state, to Borrell, to Commission President von der Leyen and the European Parliament. You contribute to move this highly pertinent issue to the top of our foreign policy agenda. So I hope that you continue what you're doing, and please rest assured as well that I will do everything in my power to continue to persuade the EU leadership and member states to come to their senses and finally go ahead with this. And in the EP, I will continue raising the issue in plenary speeches, committee hearings, seminars, and try to convince other colleagues in the Parliament as well.
Thank you, David, and thank you for everyone for tuning in, whether it was on Zoom or Facebook. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. If I could just make one additional comment, as Dr. Levitt alluded to earlier in his recently published paper on Green Without Borders, talking about Hezbollah operations on the Blue Line on the northern border of Israel. It is a great read, and I would encourage everyone to check it out. I'd like to also extend a huge thank you to Alireza, to David, and to Matthew for your participation and expertise in this panel discussion. It's certainly been very insightful, and I'm sure we will all be keeping a close eye on ongoing developments concerning Iran, Hezbollah, and the subsequent actions of the EU. I'd also like to thank Eric Fusfield for his participation in the event, and also my colleague Alina Bricman for her moderation of the webinar, and also for all her work in organising the event. And Alina, I'll now pass over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Ilan, and indeed thank you to all of you for joining us today. Alireza, Matthew, David, I think just this initial step of bringing ourselves together in this transatlantic format is really important. There's a lot, especially here in Europe, that we can learn from the experience since 1997 that the US has had in this sense. I think we're in a moment of great momentum, and hopefully we'll be able to capitalize on it. I think a first step is exactly bringing this conversation more into the mainstream. So opportunities to reach a wide audience, as today, are certainly playing their part. Thank you everyone for tuning in today, and I'm gonna pass the floor to my colleague Eric for his final remarks.
Thank you, Alina, and thank you, panelists, for their very illuminating contributions today. I think what we've seen here is that it remains a very dynamic and fluid situation, even while so much of the world's attention is focused on the coronavirus. Many of the underlying conditions in the region remain in place and are exacerbated somewhat by the pandemic. But I think what we've seen here are certainly the seeds of transatlantic cooperation. I think there's much for us to, much information to share, goals for us to remain focused on jointly, and I hope that work continues. So thank you to all of you for your contributions.